Hi, and welcome to Take Every Thought Captive, our weekly look at the Catholic intellectual tradition and an exploration of the authors, books, and topics that have shaped Catholic thinking for 2,000 years. My name is Jason Gale, and I'm joined this week by our lecturer in philosophy, Dr. Benjamin Smith, and also our lecturer in theology, Dr. Richard Buzichelli. And today our topic is going to be the topic of the overturning of Roe v. Wade, the overturning of this 49-year-old bad legislative decision that has led to an abortion industry and to the loss of life to degrees that it's hard to even imagine. As we get started here, I want to invite all the listeners, please share this content, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, so that we can continue to grow our community here online, and also to share with your friends and your family these topics so that we can think deeply about them, so we can combat some of the erroneous ideas that are out there and some of the false ideologies and worldviews that we encounter in everyday life. So let's get started. Dr. Smith, why don't you kick us off here? Let's take a few minutes and just talk about the legal technical matters before we get into the philosophical and theological aspects.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Jason. I don't want to say a ton about this, but I think it's good to just kind of clear a little bit of ground before we get into the philosophy and theology. Overturning Roe v. Wade did not make abortion illegal nationally, right? Overturning Roe v. Wade simply meant that there is that the questions return to the states, right, and to the people. And basically, this is a ruling that's very well rooted in a conservative originalist approach to the Constitution, right? The idea for conservative, strong constitutionalists is that, is that any of those powers that are not delegated to the federal government within the Constitution are retained by the states and the people. And there is no power delegated by the states that includes abortion, right? That's what the ruling was really about on this one, right? That is, it was simply the statement that there is nothing in the Constitution that grants to the federal government authority over abortion or a right, a constitutional individual right to an abortion at the federal level, right? That leaves open, whether or not certain states might have that, right? I believe that some certain state constitutions at this point have actually codified the idea that there is an individual right according to their state constitutions to abortion, right? Now we may object to that, but nevertheless, that's the kind of the constitutional setup here, right? So I think it's important to just kind of see that that's actually sort of technically what's going on here. In addition, the justices opposed the reasoning that was the basis for the decision, right? The sort of the reasoning that's rooted in goes all the way back to Griswold versus Connecticut and the putative right to privacy, as well as substantive due process. Now, those are really technical issues that I don't think we want to get into much here, but that's kind of the overall background. But I think in the American context, it's important to recognize, this makes sense, and I'll kick it over to you, Rich, but that we live in, and people always forget this, we don't live in a national democracy. We don't live in a national republic. We live in a union of states, right? And in that union, a constitutional union of states, most things on an ordinary basis that involve government, and you can actually check this out, really think about it, happen at the state and really county level. Most of the political things that actually matter to you, criminal justice, your, the power grid, your sewer system, roads, all that stuff, all of that is really taken care of at the state and county level. And the states created the federal government, right? And so they gave to it its powers that it has, right? And so it makes sense that there would be a diversity in certain areas, even important areas, right? Among the states, because the states, are different, right? So this is really, within the American context, just following the federalism that's part of our constitutional regime. What do you think about that, Rich?
Yeah, well, I think you're right about it. So let me kind of go over some of the same ground again from my own point of view.
Okay.
So I think that the decision is really important from a constitutional legal perspective, because it hits the reset button on some of these questions about how we think about the relationship between states and the federal government,
Right.
and therefore between the individual and the federal government as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it does take us a long way to restoring something of the original constitutional order.
Right.
Now, we can argue, we can have a different argument, I guess, about whether we like that arrangement or not.
Mm-hmm.
But there's something we said about playing within the rules you've set up,
Sure.
right? So if we can't do that, then we have anarchy, or we have some sort of despotism or something,
We
right?
don't have the rule of law.
But we don't really have the rule of law anymore, right?
Right.
And that's bad for everybody but the winners, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that a normal sort of rational person would agree that regardless of whether at the end of the day you got what you wanted out of the decision in terms of how the law turned out, right?
Mm-hmm.
Following the rules is prerequisite to
Sure.
civilization. You
Yeah.
just can't. All right, so that's an important thing, and I think in that regard, the decision is just correct. It's just correct.
Right.
Now, I happen to like the way it turned out also because I think abortion is a grave evil and the very kind of thing for which the political community exists, right, to prevent and to punish. But but if you do like abortion, right, again, as you said, this decision does not foreclose abortion. It just means that it's a state issue, not a federal one.
Right.
It's not a constitutional one. So, right. So I think that analysis is correct. And what I find interesting here is, I guess what I find interesting here about the people's reaction, right,
Mm-hmm.
is that they're placing an incredibly high value on. Well, I guess what I'm saying, what I see in the reaction is partly they really don't like the arrangement. They don't like the federal structure, as far as I can tell.
Sure.
Right? They really want one uniform government, and furthermore, they want that government to ratify personal autonomy
Mm-hmm.
above all other
Right.
values.
Right. Yeah. I think that's probably correct.
One thing I'll throw in there before we get into some of the personal autonomy and things like that is on a sheer practical level with regards to especially Catholic politicians who have kind of for the longest time held the argument of when they're pressed about Roe v. Wade and do they want to see it overturned and all this stuff. Many times they take the easy way out and say, well, yeah, sure, I would like it, but it's kind of the settled law of the land, and I have to respect the law that's established there. Well, now that law has been reversed,
Mm-hmm.
so they cannot rely on that simple argument of saying, like they have to be forward now. Are you pro-life or are you pro-choice?
Yeah, I think it pulls the mask off. It pulls the mask off because that was a cop out. Because we do live in a system in which you could push back against the law, right? You could lobby to change the Constitution. You could,
Sure,
yeah, right. You could, and you could argue against Roe v. Wade, right? You could, at the state level, you try to push forth laws that will challenge it,
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, that is what prevailed. That's
Right.
the technique that prevailed. So you can't. But now what you see is it's very interesting, right? Is that these people who said, I'm personally opposed, but I'm a devout Catholic, but now they lament the decision itself, the very decision that you would think would unshackle them to say, finally, well, now Roe v. Wade is over, so let's take the action that we can take. That's not the answer they're giving.
No,
right.
No, yeah, that's funny.
Right. So I think that'll have just an interesting. I think the way political speeches, political campaigns are held from now on.
Uh-huh.
Like they have to be completely for, completely against. They can't simply say, well, you know,
Uh-huh.
I take an oath to uphold the Constitution, and the justices have found that there's a legal right to privacy and therefore abortion, and so I kind of have to uphold this thing that I disagree with. Well, they overdid it. So now guess what? Like you have to actively fight against
Sure.
any sort of changes against that, with good arguments, you know, some wit, and God forbid, some backbone
Mhm.
as well. So all right, so let's get into maybe some of the philosophical and theological themes that we have to deal with a lot of this whole issue, because you do hear that a lot. Well, this, you know, was this a religious decision?
Mhm.
It seems like, you know, just some, you know, the phrase I heard on NPR was, you know, the Christian theocratic terrorists, right? Pushing their morality and pushing their religion on us. You know, is that what happened here, Dr. Smith?
I don't think so. I think
Okay.
there's two things the way to think about it. One is from just a perspective of American polity, and then
Yeah.
second, from a more philosophical or logical position. But you know, there's a deep understanding, a misunderstanding about the nature of the role of religion in the public square in the United States of America. France is an officially secular state, right?
Mm-hmm.
The United States of America, again, it's not a state, it's a union of states. But in addition to that, right, it's not an explicitly secular state. That is, it doesn't prohibit the religious expression within the public sphere, right? In fact, to the opposite, it guarantees our right to express religion, right, in the public sphere, right? That is, we have the free exercise of religion, in the Supreme Court, even before the most recent appointments, had already ruled, right, that it's really the churches and the religions that get to decide what is religious, right? So actually,
Mhm.
we have a broad right to express our religion in public, and without even shame, right? Now that said, we can't establish a religion, right? That is, we have no, the federal government has no right to establish religious practice, right? So it can't require you to go to church on Sunday. It can't require you to be a Roman Catholic. There are no religious tests for for serving in federal offices, those sorts of things, right? That would be the establishment of religion. But as a matter of fact, right, the Constitution restrains the government from restraining our free exercise of religion. So
Yep.
we can be religiously motivated in our political life. That we can't impose explicitly religious matter on people, but that doesn't keep us from expressing religious convictions, or acting with religious motives. No one objects, for example, to civil rights protesters who are civil rights protesters who are motivated by religion and sing explicitly religious songs in their protest, right? You know, you have to be consistent here. If that's not objectionable, neither is, right, conservative expressions of religion. Then second, more substantively, although it is certainly the case that for the most part, religious folks are the ones who have actively opposed abortion, right? People with religious convictions. It's not, it is not at all necessary to be religious in order to see the wrongness of abortion, right? That is one, it's not exclusively a theological argument, or I would say, maybe one way of putting it. You know, the basic claims here is not some mystical claim. They always say like this is a mystical mystery thing about when human life. It's not, right? Actually, just what does the left like to say? Follow the science, right? It's just there, right? It's like by DNA, it's human, and by observation, it's living. So it's, you know, a living human being. So what do you want to say, right? You know, that there you go, right? And is it okay to kill an innocent human being? No, therefore you shouldn't abort. Now that's an argument. You do not need to be religious in any way to recognize veracity of that argument. So it's not exclusively a religious matter, right?
Yeah, it's not exclusively a religious matter. Now, I will concede, though, that that there are ways in which your religious perspective is going to color your interpretation of the data.
Sure.
For example, if you believe as a matter of your religious conviction that it's always and everywhere wrong, directly and intentionally to take the life of an innocent human being,
Mm-hmm.
and you believe that personhood and biology attach to one another, then you're gonna hold the view that I do, that abortion is absolutely wrong.
Mm-hmm.
If you deny one or both of those premises, then obviously your perspective on abortion is going to be different. But it's fair. But I think it's fair to say that the raw data that you have a human organism, you have a human biological entity that's distinct from the mother, and it's clearly alive, right? That raw data is universally held to be significant cross-culturally, right? Across religious boundaries, it's not just Christians, it's not just in the West, it's not just at a certain period of time, but everyone seems to, well, not everyone, obviously, but historically, the vast majority of people have thought that to be morally relevant data.
Sure.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
Now, what I find interesting, though, in the current decision is that it sort of pushes back. The decision itself pushes back against the idea that what they're doing is making a religious decision.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting. My wife and I were talking about this yesterday, and she was saying how, in the past it seemed that lots of people were arguing against. They were actually making the moral arguments. It's wrong to have an abortion because of this or that reason. And while, we would both agree with the wrongness of abortion, the legal argument actually is what prevailed, not the moral one.
Yeah, of course.
In the decision, it's the legal, it's the fact the Constitution does not actually hold this view.
Right.
It doesn't clearly establish the right. There's no history in common law or in the laws of the states up to the point of Roe v. Wade that shows that this was a generally recognized right. Mm-hmm. And for that reason, there's no legal basis for the decision. It was entirely the legal argument, not the moral one, that prevailed in this particular case.
Well, that's as it should be, I think, for the most part, in constitutional matters, right? I mean, we hope and believe that the Constitution as a whole, right, in general, secures things that are morally good, right? Mm-hmm. And I think, we could say in general it does. But the justices are primarily there to enforce the human law, right, which is the Constitution. Obviously they can recognize and should recognize a higher law, but the default position, right, should be to interpret and apply the Constitution faithfully.
So the very end of the decision, of the majority opinion, you see that Alito actually recognizes that there's room for the polity within the states to legislate according to their moral views.
Sure.
And that Roe v. Wade foreclosed that possibility for them.
Yeah.
On this matter.
Yeah, and it's a huge course correction, right? Because we have heard this thing, although it never made any coherent sense, you shouldn't legislate morality. Everybody legislates morality. Why? What would you be legislating other than morality? Right? At the end of the day, right? You think something should or should not be the case, right? You're valuing some outcomes over others, right? You're trying to protect certain things from others because you see them to be desirable, right? That's all. I mean, you just can't escape morality and ethics. But now we can have in the states, right, where it does belong, substantive arguments, right, about ethics and morality, right, and legislate in a way that reflects the moral convictions of the community. And that's great. I mean, I think,
Right. So going forward then, right, when you look at, it looks like the cultural divide in America is going to get deeper.
that's correct. Yeah, I think so. I think so. But, and this, that makes sense because there is something that the left is correct about, right? I hear this sometimes, and the justices sort of try to kind of skirt this issue, right? But sometimes the people on the left will say it's not really about abortion; it's a bigger agenda, right?
Yeah.
There's more going on here. It's not really about just saving innocent babies, right? And of course, we would say, of course, it's about protecting innocent human life. But they're also correct, right? That there is a bigger agenda, right?
Mhm.
There is a larger cultural ethos that those who oppose abortion are really advancing, and those who are against, those who are for abortion have a different ethos, right? A different view, I would say, of the good life and of the highest good, right?
Which they're also aggressively advancing.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. This idea that, well, the neutral position is to be for abortion, and the radically religious theocratic view is to be, against abortion, right? That's just one-sided and biased. No, you have two rival versions of the good life contesting one another, right? And that's why it's correct to call it a culture conf, right? It is a culture war, right? Patrick Buchanan was exactly right to say that all those years ago, right? A lot of people are weary of the culture war, but I'm sorry, the war is not weary of you, right? It's here, and you just have to face the reality of that, or live in delusion, right? And there's different ways to frame the culture war. One way I would like to frame it is natural order or natural law. I like natural order versus autonomy, right? And this is kind of approaching it in a way that's philosophical. I think you can, of course, expand this into a theological account as well. But I think it's useful, at least, to kind of maybe just pedagogically, to kind of think about it philosophically for a while. When so many of the arguments are all about, it's all about my body, my choice. I shouldn't be made to do something I don't want to do, right? I'm autonomous, right? I'm a law unto myself, right? And really, since Kant, and maybe a little before that, that's become the modern version of freedom, right? Is that I'm a law unto myself, and I shape my life, and nothing heterogeneous shapes my life. I, Otto, right, shape my own life, right? And so when it comes to things about, like, say, sex or abortion, sex is whatever I want it to be, right? It's, whatever I think, whatever I want it to be. If it's just recreational, right, then that's fine. That's what I say. And if you want to have your stuffy religious view or your stuffy virtue view of it, that's fine for you. But sex has no inherent meaning, no inherent purpose, right? I would contrast that with the view of the good life that there is such a thing as human flourishing, right? And that there's an objective sort of character to human flourishing that's rooted in our nature as human beings.
There's a right way to be human.
That's right. Exactly. Yes. And it's not 100% uniform, but there's a general pattern to it, right? And that pattern or pathway includes the idea that sex is for family, that sex and family are deeply rooted in one another and connected, and that as insofar as sex begins to move away from family, right, it's vulgar and vicious, right, and that's to be avoided and undesirable even for you. You may enjoy engaging in vicious sexual activity, degraded sexual activity, but it's actually not good for you. It doesn't contribute to your human flourishing, right? Those are two very different approaches to the good life, right? One sees it, as something that has a fixed pattern and you conform to that pattern. The other says, I make it up as I go, and and it's I am the central reference point. How do you, do you think that's a good way to divide the two?
Yeah, I think it's totally right.
I think it maybe the way I approach it is, I mean, you're dealing with just two antithetical anthropologies.
Yeah.
They're just, and again, while our theology does inform us on reality, it's the reason why we say these things from the pulpit, and the reason why the church teaches many of these things is because the church has observed reality, right? So we're not saying like, even some of these things about the human person, we're not saying that it is even part of divine revelation. We're simply saying these are things that can be observed from natural order, right?
Yeah. Although I want to push back on it a little though. So I agree with you. Don't get me wrong. I agree with what you're saying. I think that like Aristotle and Thomas, to name just two individuals, one pagan and the other Christian, would agree for the most part, right, on these kinds of questions. And obviously they're coming from two very different religious perspectives. So they are observing human nature and coming to many of the same conclusions. But there's no question that revelation informs what we know about human beings, right? There are things there are things from revelation that we can't discover by nature alone. And that is going to affect our moral conclusions to some degree.
Sure.
I would say though that what you're talking about there is the stuff that's more around the periphery. So for example, I'm agreeing with you. I personally have this tendency to resist what is sort of a reduction. I'm not really accusing you of this, but it's just I see people do this a lot, and it drives me crazy. The reduction of Christian morality to just pure natural morality,
right?
And I think we do obscure things that way. But
I would agree. Yeah, I totally agree with you. I just think like from just a pure experiential basis. If you were to ask face to face with somebody, not in some phone poll or something like that, is sex meaningless? Do you, where does the meaning of, where does the, if you were to ask people that, I think a lot of people would say, well, it does have meaning, okay, like, so I think there's a lot of things that the non-religious person can arrive at, well, not fully, or as I don't think they can go as far or as deep as the Christian can because of divine revelation. I think there's things that we can know from natural experience and common sense. That we've reached a point in anthropology where people are just simply actively denying common sense and observation, right?
Well, they act as if no one ever had ideas like this before there was Christianity, which is clearly false. Right, exactly. You obviously haven't read any philosophy.
Yeah, I would say a good example of this would be, I think it's Rufinus, right? I mean, Rufinus and Paul sound almost identical, right? When they talk about moral matters, right? Rufinus is a Roman Stoic, right?
Yeah.
And the morality is like, as far as these matters go, right? Obviously there are additional matters, but as far as these kinds of matters go, right, the morality sounds very much the same. Notably, like the Stoics were famous for opposing the Greek tradition of exposure, right? On this very issue, right? The Stoics resisted the idea of abortion and exposure of infants, right? So, one can come to these conclusions, right, on the basis of reason and natural order, and obviously the church even teaches the same, that's true, right? That we can discover these things, and I think that's important, right? Obviously, you say, Rich, the data of revelation adds a great deal to that and enriches it and strengthens it. But that order is there, right? I see it was sort of a kind of intertwined twofold source, it's mutually reinforcing. And I think, what both certainly say, right, the natural order, is that sex is for family, right? We can't even understand. I mean, in a biology book, I'm sure at some point they're going to get rid of this, but it's still called the reproductive system, right? Because we can't understand the parts and the arrangement and the functions of these things apart from the objective of reproduction, right? Which points to, right, the idea of that this is not meaningless. There's an inherent meaning to it, an inherent order to it, right? Which is the procreation and education of children, right? Historically, right, the family grew up around this this function, right? Which is seen as part of a flourishing human life, right?
Yeah, because you're not a mere individual, right?
That's right. That's right. And just think about all the goodness, all the ethical and moral and virtues that go into family life, right? I think so much of moral growth, right, comes out of your commitment to your family, right? To providing for your family, sacrificing for your family, reaching compromises with your spouse, all these sorts of things, right? There's an enormous amount of moral growth that happens, right? I think I know people, and I grieve for them, that have purposely made the decision either to never be married or to be married and never have children, right? And I grieve for them, not because they offend me. It doesn't harm me, but I grieve for them because I think they've lost out, right? And even people like Homer or Aristotle or anybody from the ancient world, right, would look at most people from the ancient world. We're looking like, what? Like, you don't want a family? Like, you don't want to reproduce? You don't want to carry on your family heritage, your family legacy from your ancestors into the present and beyond, right? I mean, those are all very natural and essential parts, right, of human flourishing. Whereas the autonomous person is basically looking at his parents, his grandparents, right, and saying, family's optional, maybe, maybe not. I know you gave me life, but I may not pass it on. Right?
But this really
isn't that interesting way? I mean, think about it, right?
Yeah, it cuts to the heart of the problem, right? Because you could see the thing, the two choices here, right, between autonomy and responsibility to a higher law, they reflect the autonomous person regards the past, regards tradition, regards inheritance, right, as something negotiable. It's a smorgasbord from which he can pick and choose what he wants or leave it entirely behind if nothing suits him.
Right.
He could reshape things on his own. And if you think about the way in which that culture has been pushed by the those who hold the levers of power for a very long time now, right? It's pretty clear, actually, right? How for the past 30, 40 years, how many times, right, have you seen it pushed in, say, sitcoms or something, right?
Right.
That family is what you choose. It's not what you inherit.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Right. Okay. I think that's a good way of putting it.
So you'll and that's always like Thanksgiving comes, so it's the Thanksgiving show, right?
Right. Yeah.
And they always contrive some way of all the main characters like not going home to their families of origin, but staying with each other. And the reaffirmation that, well, that's what family really is. The people you choose for yourself. Right. It's pushing this autonomy culture.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I think so. I've heard this. Rich, you can do family in lots of ways. You can family in various ways. Turn it.
Right.
What are you gonna say, Jason?
I think from when you're looking at it from, I just see themselves kind of this idea of holding up autonomy as it's completely self-defeating for a functional society.
Of course. Yes.
Because
and look at the fruits.
It's pretty suicidal.
And the thing is we on the one hand we sit here and we push, we want people to live for other people, right? You need to do this so that it helps out these other people. You need to do this because your uncomfort of, let's just the first thing that comes to my mind is wearing a mask. You're uncomfortable in doing that or something like that, right? It's for other people's good. So we push for that on the one hand, but at the same time we're saying, but at the heart of truth, at the foundation of you as a human person, your autonomy is what is most important. Like, how do we expect us to set that as a foundation of saying, you are you, and you get to define everything about yourself, to the point of destroying pronouns, to the point of destroying parts of the English language,
Sure,
right?
Sure.
But at the same time, we want them to grow up and be virtuous, right?
It's incoherent.
The two don't
It
make
is
sense.
incoherent.
It's
completely
completely incoherent.
Yeah.
And I don't understand how we're going to get, this orange juice out of squeezing rocks. Like, it's just
Right.
Well,
yeah,
it's,
you're right.
it is incoherent. It's interesting because, we go back to Kant. Dr. Smith mentioned Kant earlier, right? And
unfortunately.
the thing about Kant, though, the actual historical Kant, agree with him or don't, preferably don't, but but the thing is, he wouldn't have liked what he sees today.
No.
This is not the kind of
Yeah.
autonomy that he had in mind.
Yeah.
And I think that, he would have promoted this idea of choosing to be virtuous as part of your, that is your law, right? That's your autonomy, is that you opt to be a virtuous person. And so that's what people fall back on when everything begins to collapse around them and they realize, without being able to say it, that there has to be more than just me. They turn to a Kantian appeal to choose to be virtuous in the ways that they've decided are important.
Sure.
But it's incoherent, right?
Yeah,
it is incoherent.
Yeah, it's incoherent because it's not part of a larger consistent view of the being of human beings, right?
Yeah.
It has no metaphysical substructure that really roots you, right, in that option to be the right thing, right? Or to do
Well, they're
the right
even
thing.
bad Kantians because they're very bad Kant. Because the thing is, Kant, right? He prioritized reason over reason. And they've made the opposite choice. They've prioritized will over reason.
Yeah, and passion.
Yeah, and I would even just go so far. It's delusional. It is. They're basing something that is. They're forming something, whether it be themselves or trying to form society based on something that is outside of reality, right? It's fantasy. It's I don't know exactly what the right word is for it, but it's simply not based in reality.
Yeah.
And like you said, when sex is for the family, right? Family is essential to flourishing life, right? It's So I mean, like these kind of aspects, and even understanding your, like you said, happiness within like those relationships. And again, our Christian faith tells us much more about this from what God has revealed, but we're sitting here trying to create something that is virtuous by promoting just something that is completely self-centered. It's divine navel gazing or whatever you want to call it.
Right. I think so. Yeah. I mean, I think in the happiness in the sort of natural law, natural order point of view, right? It has the idea that your life can be excellent if you conform to this pattern, right? That's rooted in your being, and that rooted in your being is the need for, the desire for, the inclination for relationships with others, including friendships, right? Including marriage, including being a father, being a mother, including being a good fellow citizen, all those sorts of things, right? But what we've got there, right, is a sort of a preset, right, kind of direction or path, right, that as you follow it, right, you grow into genuine human flourishing. Family is a part of that, an important part. It's not the only part, but it's an important part of that. You just think about the joy that you experience, and anybody who's had kids in a decently healthy situation as experiences. The joy of your parents, right? When they see your children. Do you know what I'm saying? Like that intergenerational thing I'm talking about, it's a reality, right? And it's something that I think we do experience in that moment. The whole family comes around and they celebrate and there's rejoicing, right? Because the family is continuing, right? You're affirming really your parents, your grandparents, your whole family when you perpetuate, right? Your family. I think that's a big deal. And you're satisfying more than just yourself, you're satisfying others. Whereas the autonomous thing at the end of the day, right, is ultimately, since you're a law unto yourself, right, it's about self-satisfaction, right? It's not about, oh, this is going to hurt my children. Oh, this is going to offend my parents, or, things like that, right? It's about satisfying myself, right? That sort of thing, right? So, I mean, I think once you've made the link between, once you've made autonomy the foundation of your life, right, then it's inevitable that you're going to become egocentric, narcissistic. I mean, that's why we have so many problems in this area, because we have created a culture in which we teach people that you can do whatever you want to do. You're number one. You got to put yourself first, all that sort of thing. Well, that's inevitably going to end up with all that matters is satisfaction. And if having a baby right now is not satisfying to me, I can have it eliminated. Right. Whereas the person on the path of virtue is that even if the person is on the path of virtue and say has made a poor decision, right, and gotten pregnant out of wedlock or something like that, the virtuous person, the person who's on that path, can say, "Oh man, I really messed up. Let's see how, like, let's figure out how to go forward in a way that respects, the fact that I've had a child." Right. I think that those are two, very divergent paths.
Yeah, actually,
and I think or go ahead, Dr. Buscaglia.
Yeah, I just have some thoughts on that particular thing. The way I kind of look at those situations where a person makes a misstep and suddenly there's a baby in the picture. It seems to me that in God's infinite mercy, you have in that very moment a call back to the person, like the man and the woman in the garden when God calls after sin, where are you? Right? That there's this call of the person back to the path of virtue by the sheer reality that a child has been conceived, and that this calls for a responsible decision, it calls for me to sort of take into account, right, someone other than myself or my own gratification, my own needs. What do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think that's conviction. And if you have the right form of, I think Thomas calls it shamefacedness, right? Like the right sense of, conscience and so forth, that, yeah, it's an opportunity for growth, right? An opportunity for self-sacrifice, for attending to the good of others, that sort of thing. But, if you're taught your whole life, honey, you got to take care of yourself, number one, right? And you're on this path of autonomy, that stuff just isn't going to come in the picture.
Yeah, and I think the culmination of that kind of worldview is abortion.
Yeah.
Where you will not just ignore your neighbor, so that, like, I really don't want to help my neighbor because then I'd have to give up my Saturday, or I'd have to give up my free time. I can't watch Netflix, and that I don't really want to do that. So it goes so much beyond just simply ignoring your neighbor to killing your neighbor,
right?
For your convenience. So I mean, like, I think that the position of abortion is that high point of consequence or of this kind of worldview, where we should, the person should be willing to sacrifice anything and everything for their own autonomy.
Right. Anything and anyone.
And anyone, yeah.
Right.
And I think this is where the Catholic needs to recognize, like, it's not just a difference of opinion or whatever, that that the virtues promoted by and held up by the Christian faith really become the vices of this kind of worldview.
Yeah.
Right.
That's
You
a
know,
good point.
we hold up, the opposing view, holds up things like pride and selfishness, self-centeredness. I get to decide all of these things, whereas the Christian says, no, not only are you not the center, but God is first and other people are second. Like you don't even get second place in this. And we're called to make a sacrifice of ourselves. What does that what does that mean? I mean,
Right,
that doesn't
So-
sound fun. That doesn't sound enjoyable as a Catholic. But again, if we understand part of our design, right, that even the way that life is created, I mean, a woman gives up so much of her body in order to bring about new life, and therefore the world is a bigger and better place. That even kind of the self-sacrificial attitudes and virtues we should strive to have. I mean, it's built, it's even built into the very biological makeup of reproduction and family life as a whole, even for dads, right? They sacrifice their bodies to toil for the good of the family, right? So the Christian way of life is really not just at odds, but actively against this kind of lifestyle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree.
So here's how right you are on this. Okay. You can observe in the culture, right, that these days there's been an awful lot of screaming. You watch the news or something, and something like this decision comes out, or somebody gets elected to office that you don't like, and people in funny looking hats and stuff will just scream. They'll just scream, right? Or they'll stand with a bullhorn directly in the face of another person and just scream through it. What I find interesting about this kind of thing, all the screaming, is that what you have, I think, is people trying to silence that voice that speaks for something beyond themselves. Right? It's the voice of conscience, ultimately the voice of God, right? The voice of the moral authority. That voice must be drowned out so that I have to not hear it. I can't allow myself to be convicted by it, lest I can no longer justify being a law unto myself. That's what I see. I don't know if that's what you see.
I think that's totally right. I mean, I think that screaming is effectively sort of an emotional ad baculum, right? I mean, it's basically a resort to a kind of force, right? To ignore the issue. I mean, absolutely. I think that's a good observation, Rich. I think one other just kind of area to kind of drawing a close here to think about these the antitheses here, right? Is you notice of people who adopt autonomy, right, as their number one thing, tend to be low on patriotism, right? Tend to be low on service to the country and service to the community, low on wanting to preserve your national heritage, right? The heritage of your people, that sort of thing. Whereas those who follow natural order and virtue tend to see those things as very important, right? Again, this is where we go, the family, right, contributes, right, to the political community, right? We used to recognize that the individual is not the primary unit of society, right? The primary unit of society is the family. And that's so for one very obvious reason, right? Where do our future citizens come from, right? They come from families, right? And listen, think about this. In family life, you're conditioned, if it's at all decently ordered, to not just care about yourself, right? To respect the authority of your parents, learn to respect authority, learn to sacrifice for the common good of the family. You might not use that terminology, but a lot of times that happens. No, we can't watch your TV program because we actually have to do this thing for your brother, right? Or whatever it is, like or your mom's sick, so we got to go to the hospital and we don't have, that kind of thing. You learn self-sacrifice, you learn to care for others, and you learn to respect authority, right? Those sorts of things. all of which contributes to the flourishing of society, right? What about these autonomous people, right? If you value autonomy, the idea that you have an unchosen obligation to society, they utterly reject, right? And I've seen people say patriotism is stupid because you can't control where you're born, as if it's only valuable, right, if valuing your community and your history, if you've chosen it, right? Instead of being the position of the person of virtue is to be grateful that my community brought me into being, right? You see, what a radical difference. Right?
Yeah, I think actually the fourth commandment, right? Honor your father and your mother is deeply bound up with everything we're talking about.
Yeah. I mean, it's that idea of piety, right? You know,
that idea that I begin from the very foundation of my life. I begin from something I did not choose.
That's right.
But that I received.
Yeah.
Right. And the only proper response is gratitude.
Yes. Absolutely.
And you even hear them making that distinction. Sometimes the people that are fighting for the right to abortion, they say, is they'll say, well, I consented to have sex, but I did not consent to be pregnant. And it's like, well, that's what happens when you do that thing. Like when you reject kind of this when you reject the natural order of things,
right, yeah,
and you reduce all good to simply the exercise of your autonomy, even to the point of neglecting your intellect. That you can make arguments like this with a straight face.
I mean, let me give an example that would follow that. I consented to drive drunk. I did not consent to run into that family while I was driving drunk. Does that work?
Not my problem. Yeah.
No, it doesn't. I consented to do something that by its very nature, right, raises this possibility. Does that make sense? You know, like, I mean, come on. That's
you're responsible for consequences that are unforeseen. You know, that's part of life.
Well, they are foreseen, though.
Foreseeable, at least, right?
They're foreseeable, right?
Yeah.
And that's, by the way, that's well established. Interestingly, in the decision we were talking about before, right? There's a discussion of that very thing, what we now call, like felony murder rule, right? That's a very old concept in common law. According, it's outlined in this in the Dobbs decision that there was this idea a long time ago that if, say, you have an abortion and a woman dies as a result of the abortion, well, because you were doing something bad to begin with, you're liable for her death, homicide. That's what the felony murder rule is, and that whole thing, right? It involves the idea that if I undertake an action knowing, and in that case, it's a bad action. But if I understand, and I would say abortion is too, or premarital sex, but if I undertake an action and that consequence is foreseeable, well, by taking the action, I'm responsible for the consequences. Sure.
Yeah. And so if you think about all of those things together, right, you can see, right, like what contributes to society more, right? What contributes to the common good, right, of the polis more, right? The lifestyle of autonomy or natural virtue, clearly virtue does, right? It clearly, right, sets up a person who respects authority, who's self-sacrificing, cares about the good of others, right, and acts for the good of others. Whereas the autonomous person just sees all that as optional, right? And then if you sort of just like the last question here, think about, well, which lifestyle should the community promote, right? You know, if you follow, right, the dialectic here between these two antithetical ways of life, clearly the state has an interest in promoting the life of virtue, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's in the very interest of, besides the fact that it's good for the citizens, that's the most important thing, but it's even good for the state. Right?
Yeah. So let me rephrase the question. Is it reasonable and appropriate for the political community to promote virtue, right? To promote that which is good for the flourishing of the community as a whole?
Yeah. Yes. And it is clearly, right? I mean, like, what would you say? Like, no, we should not have a flourishing of the community, right? I mean,
that should not be the interest of the state, right?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you could say like I mean, I guess the autonomous person could say, well, to hell with the community, to hell with all of it. I'm just gonna,
Yeah.
I'd rather see the world burn than me give up my autonomy.
Well,
Not
that's
very
why
many
we
people know
invented means of removing people from full
That's right.
participation in the community, exile, prison.
Mm. Yeah. So I mean, that would almost be Luciferian, right? Like in the sense of I'd rather be in hell, right, than serve God in heaven, right? Now most people aren't going to be, take it all the way to that logical kind of conclusion, right? But that just shows you the incoherence of the lifestyle. And to take all this back to abortion, right? Abortion grows out of the autonomous worldview, the path of autonomy, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's contrary to the path of virtue, right, and natural order. And so I think, from a philosophical perspective, kind of going beyond just say the American constitutional polity, but looking at philosophy, like from the perspective of political philosophy, abortion, abortion is something that should be impermissible, right, not permitted. Right, within a political community, because it's contrary to the flourishing of the citizens and the common good of the whole polity.
Yes.
The end. There we go.
Yeah. No, it's not the only reason, but it's
not the only reason. Yeah, but I think it's a sufficient.
It's a sufficient reason.
Yeah, and I think that there's a big picture there, right? That I think is important. I think the left gets it right, and when they're screaming, they're right. We are in a culture war.
Yeah.
And these two ways of life are antithetical. And within our own community, we're struggling to return to virtue, right? And move away from this order of autonomy, right? Or can't call it an order, path of autonomy, right? And that is really, I think, what's a big part of what's at stake in Roe versus Wade and maybe future developments.
So to conclude here, and I'll throw it to each of y'all. How big is this overturning of Roe v. Wade with regards to the culture war? Is it just another political move, or is there an actual turning here that you can see maybe in our society?
I heard somebody on the left comment on this yesterday, and I thought she was correct. She said, this is the single greatest victory of the modern conservative movement. I think she's correct. Right? In terms of the culture war, this is an atomic bomb. I mean, it's an enormous, it's a lightning strike, and I think it's been building. This is the part that makes me really optimistic. And I've been feeling this way for several years now. I think it's been building. I didn't predict that this was going to happen. Don't misunderstand me. I kind of maybe about a year ago started thinking it could happen, but I've been seeing, right, people responding to the extremism on the cultural left, right, moving in the right direction. People kind of like backing into the position of virtue, just sort of like, oh my goodness, like what's going on here, right? My country's falling apart, right? So I think this is part of a larger movement back towards virtue. At the same time, I think it's unique. I mean, it's the best thing I've in my life. It's the biggest thing I've ever seen on the political, cultural, sphere. On the good side. So.
What's really interesting to me is the fact that just a couple of years ago, very modest restrictions on abortion were being struck down by the Supreme Court.
That's right.
On the basis of Roe v. Wade, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so I do think this is clearly a seismic shift.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a seismic shift that works on a number of different levels.
Yeah.
The first level we talked about at the beginning of the podcast, which was a restoration of a different view of constitutional law than has prevailed in jurisprudence in the United States for the past half century or more.
Right.
Maybe more than that, really. I mean, going back to the time of Roosevelt, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you've got sort of this is a real victory for originalism.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so that's a huge factor, right? But even from a moral perspective, what it finally does is it really does now permit the populace to enact legislation that reflects their moral views and promotes the flourishing of the society, according to traditional moral values. And so that's been prevented, right? That's been prevented by Roe v. Wade. And the logic of Roe v. Wade, Thomas, in his concurring opinion, is completely right about this. All right, the logic of Roe v. Wade worked against all manner of things.
Right.
And so there's a whole slew of Supreme Court precedent that's now called into question,
right,
on related topics, right,
yeah.
including same-sex marriage and other things, that can now be revisited on the basis of a shift in our constitutional philosophy. And even though in the decision, Alito said this decision doesn't address those matters, it only speaks about abortion, it only speaks about Roe v. Wade vis-a-vis abortion, Thomas is right that the implications are broader than that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I just pray that this is more of a Saul to Paul moment rather than a Franz Ferdinand moment. In our current historical moment.
But you're not going to see, though, a uniform transformation of the United States toward virtue. There's going to be a deepening of division, I'm sure of it. Yeah. But we have our path. Like you said, Dr. Smith, we have a path. It's clear. It takes a lot of hard work, not just like back-breaking work. But mental work and working to understand the design, the path that God has laid forward for us, and both the design of us as human persons, but also the design of all of life, right? The place of family, the place of sex, the place of happiness, excellence, virtue, all of these things, and how they fit into not just human flourishing, but society's flourishing as a whole. All right, guys. Thanks a lot for this interesting discussion. And I hope all of our listeners can benefit from this. Please do share this. And one other thing I also want to point you to is please, as all these things come up, please go to Amazon, check out Dr. Smith's book, Understanding Modern Political Ideas, a guidebook for Christians and other patriots. Dr. Smith lays out well some not just political ideas, but political principles that Christians can follow to navigate these rough waters that have not become any easier while we do enjoy this one victory. In the meantime, check out all of our content over at CatholicStudiesAcademy.com. God bless.